Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel, and today guys, we will be reading Who Was George Washington by Roberta Edwards, illustrated by True Kelly. It might be True Kelly, because one part is cut off, but I think it's True Kelly. Yep. Anyways, let's get started with Chapter 1, A Boy from Virginia. On the night of February 22, 1732, Augustine Washington sat at the table by candlelight. A family Bible lay open before him. Gus, as every called him, was a tobacco farmer in the colony of Virginia with a pen made from the quill of a turkey. He wrote down his name of his son, George, who had been born that very morning. George's mother, Mary, was Gus's second wife. His first wife had died, leaving him with two teenage sons. One night, not long before George was born, a bolt of lightning shot down the chimney of Washington's farmhouse and killed a woman who was visiting Mary. Mary worried that the lightning was a sign of bad luck. It might mean that there'd be something wrong with her baby. But George was a strong, healthy baby. People said he looked like his mother. He grew into a tall, athletic boy who loved to ride horses through the green countryside. In later years, he was known as the best horseman in Virginia. Okay. Fairy Farm, yay! When George was about seven, the family moved to Fairy Farm. It was across the river from Fredericksburg, Virginia. By this time, George had a younger sister, Betty, and three younger brothers, Samuel, John, and Charles. People said George and Betty looked a lot alike. As a grown woman, she would do funny imitations of her famous brother. There isn't any information about how George and his father got along, but we do know that he wasn't close to his mother. Mary Washington was a cold, bossy woman. All George's friends were scared of her. Strangely, she never took pride in her eldest son, not even after he became president. His letters to her began "Honored Madame" instead of "Dear Mother," and he never introduced his wife, Martha, to her. The person he loved best in the world was his kind half-brother, Lawrence. Lawrence was Gus's oldest son. He was 14 years older than George. Lawrence had gone to school in England. He learned Greek and Latin. He knew how to dress like a gentleman and act like a gentleman. There wasn't enough money to send George off to England. Instead, he was taught at home, probably by his father and Lawrence. George was great at math, anything with numbers: tricorn hat, stock neck scarf, fitted coat, waistcoat, walking stick, breeches, leather boots with deep cuffs. Anything with numbers came easily to him, but he was a terrible speller. It embarrassed him all his life. When George was only 11, his father died. From time to time, George was invited for long visits to Vermont. This was the home of the Lawrence and his new bride, Anne Fairfax. George loved it there. In 1746, George had asked to move in for good, and off he went. He probably was happy to get away from his mother. The Washington's family coat of arms, the Latin motto, means the outcome justifies the deed. Chapter 2, Mount Vernon. At Mount Vernon, a whole new world opened up for George. Now he mixed with the richest families in Virginia. He went fox hunting and to fancy balls. Shy and a little awkward, George wanted to fit in very badly. So he took dancing lessons. In time, he became the excellent dancer. Here's a map of Mount Vernon, which I cannot show you because I will have to go into my camera thingy. Okay. Mount Vernon was 80,000 acres, acres, whatever that means. There's a fruit orchards, a nursery, paddock, wharf, laundry, smokehouse, coach house, kitchen, stable, paddock, lower garden, bowling green, storehouse, upper garden, garden houses, to muddy hole farms, slave quarters, to river farm fields, spinning rooms, and overseers' houses, white servants' halls. George took fencing lessons and learned about music. He wore nicer clothes. He also wrote himself a long list of rules about good manners. One of the rules were not spitting into a fire while meat was being cooked in it. Another rule was to avoid killing fleas and lice in the presence of other people. Lawrence's in-laws and the Fairfaxes were one of the richest families in Virginia. They owned huge tracts of land. There were no maps yet of the West, part of the colony, so people often hired surveyors. A surveyor's job was to measure, and mark property boundaries. It was the perfect job for George. He loved the outdoors, was quick at math, and indeed to earn money. Besides no maps, there were no roads in western Virginia. It was wilderness. So as a survey, George lived in a rough life. For weeks on end, he'd wear the same clothes, sleep on the ground, along with other hired men, cook over an open fire, and try to steer clear of the hostile bands of Indians. George grew to a broad-shouldered young man with clear blue-gray eyes and reddish-brown hair. He wore it in a ponytail. At 6'2", he was often the tallest person in a group. His hands and feet were huge, except for his bad teeth. He was in excellent health. Lawrence, unfortunately, had much more serious health problems. He developed a terrible cough in the hope that warm water might help his brother. George had Lawrence sailed to the island of Barbados, off Venezuela. It was George Washington's first and only trip outside North America. Sadly, Lawrence's health did not improve, and George came down with smallpox, another deadly disease. George survived. Lawrence, however, died in 1752. That's sad. And that was George's loved one, his most loved one. So that's sad. In 1752, with George at his beside, it was a terrible blow. For George, he was only 20, and he had lost the person he loved most. George Washington not only loved Lawrence, he respected him. Lawrence had been an officer in the militia. A militia is a group of part-time soldiers who are not part of the regular army. Now Lawrence's post was open. George took his brother's place. A militia man. That looks weird. Chapter 3, A Young Soldier. George, age 25. It was the early 1750s. For some time, France and England had been fighting over land in the Ohio River Valley. The problem was simple. Both countries wanted to control it. The French built many forts in the area. They wanted to keep British colonists hemmed in the East Coast. George Washington was sent to deliver a warning to the French. Abandon the forts at once. The French ignored his message. Still, the trip was an important one for George. Along with the small band of men, he traveled through 1,000 miles of wilderness. He crossed 2 ranges of mountains. He got thrown off a crude raft into the icy river. The water was so cold his clothes froze solid. Yet he made it home safely and was promoted for his bravery. He wrote a journal about his travels and appeared in newspapers. The Journal of Major George Washington made him famous. And I think he killed a snake, because there's a picture that called Join or Die. Oh, Join or Die. In 1754, Benjamin Franklin drew to his urge colonists to unite to fight the French. Join or die. You can't beat them, you join them. A few months later, he was sent back to the Ohio River Valley. This time, there were more than 150 men with him. They were to build a fort. The British and French were not openly at war, but when Washington's men came upon French soldiers, a shot rang out. Which side began the attack? To this day, no one is sure who started it, but while Washington lost none of his men, 10 French soldiers ended up dead. Among them was their leader. Dun, dun, dun. That was all it took to spark a real war between the French and British. Soon 800 French soldiers along the 400 Indians attacked Washington's much smaller army. 100 of his men died. No! What choice did he have to accept to surrender? He and his men were not taken prisoner. Instead, they had to abandon their fort and return home. For George, the defeat was a big blow. All his life, he was concerned about his image. He wanted to appear brave, honorable. To surrender was embarrassing. Yet once again, he was praised for his leadership. His career as a soldier was taking off next. He became the aide of the British general, in charge of chasing out the French from the Ohio Valley. Up to now, Washington had led American soldiers. Now he was to serve alongside the tough, fearsome redcoats. This was the nickname for the soldiers in the British Army because of the bright red coats they wore. The general assembled a mighty force of 2,000 men to attack one of the largest French forts. A redcoat soldier is carrying this whip thingy, which looks cool. But I'd rather prefer the Americans to win, because we are living in America right now. Okay. In Europe, enemy armies met face to face in open fields. Line after line of the troops would march straight toward one another, firing cannons and muskets. Washington warned the British general that fighting was done differently in America. The enemy would come at the redcoats from all sides. The French and Indians would attack from the woods. They would stay hidden behind trees and rocks. The general refused to listen. The redcoats were to attack as they had been trained to. The result of a typical battle in America. British troops, Frenchland, Indian troops. British troops are on that side, enemy troops. Oh my gosh, they're battling. French and Indian troops are crushing the British troops. They are wrecking. They're coming from like all different sides. The British die, die, die. Was a crushing disaster for the British. Soldiers on horseback were moved down by hidden French and Indian forces. Soon, hundreds of redcoats lay dead as Fort Washington, 4 musket shots tore through his coat. His hat was shot off his head. 2 horses were shot from under him. Yet he was hit. He was never hit. The general was not so lucky. He died from a battle wound, so George Washington took command of all the frontier forces. He was only 22 years old. For 5 years, he helped build more than 80 forts in the Ohio River Valley for 5 years. He fought against French troops as well as the hostile bands of Indians. In the end, the British won. What became known as the French and Indian War. Colonists were known free to move west and settle the rich lands of the Ohio River Valley. Chapter 4. Country Life. George had seen through the war. He gave up his command and turned to Virginia. His brother Lawrence's wife had died. She had no living children, so Mount Vernon had belonged to George. He intended to live there peacefully for the rest of his life. The dance, George met a very rich young widow, which 2 young children. Yeah, it's a widow, not window. A very rich young widow with 2 young children. Her name was Martha Custis. She was short and plump with a warm smile. She knew the same people George knew. They both wanted the same kind of country life. In all ways, it was a good match. I have found an agreeable partner, he wrote to a friend. On January 6, 1759, they were married. They both were 27 years old, although never wildly in love. There was a strong bond between them. Martha called George Old Man or Papa. Sadly, they had no children together, but he doted upon little Patsy and her older brother Jackie. Patsy and Jackie. Okay. Jackie Custis was 4 and his younger sister Patsy was 2 when their mother married George Washington. George was good to his stepchildren. He ordered fine clothes and toys for them from England. George was very upset when a doll for Patsy didn't arrive on time. Patsy was a sweet girl. From the time she was very young, she had seizures. Oh gosh! Which grew worse as she got older. Doctors had no idea how to help her. She died after a seizure when she was only 17. Oh gosh! That is so brutal. We should not talk about that any time later. Jackie was a spoiled and lazy boy. All he wanted was to have fun. He lasted only a few months at college in New York before coming home. Wow. I would rather have Patsy than Jackie. I'm telling you, if she had more seizures, I would be scared. I would be really scared, and that would be really brutal. Didn't I say we would not talk about this later, which was right now? Let's stop talking about it. He was a failure as a farmer and died at 26. Just weeks after his stepfather's army won the war, from independence, Jackie's son and daughter were raised at Mount Vernon by George and Martha. Jackie's wife had 2 older daughters who lived nearby in Virginia. As for why George Washington had no family of his own, many historians think smallpox left him unable to have children. Wow, no. Okay. Both George and Martha loved to entertain. When he was a much older man, he claimed he was Martha. When he was a much older man, he claimed he and Martha hadn't dined alone in 20 years. Nearly every week, company stayed over at Mount Vernon. Washington was a most considerate host. One guest with a bad cold reported waking up in the night. There in his room stood George Washington with a hot cup of tea for him. Martha Washington in middle age. She looks old and tired. George in sweet lips at Vernon. I think it's a dog or the horse. 2 or 3 times a week, Washington went for hunting. One of his hunting dogs was named, was named Sweet Lips. He liked to play cards and gamble gambling's so bad, guys. You can lose so much money for small sums of money. I know, right, guys? Gambling's so hard. You can put something valuable in and it will just scam you. If you put $100 in and it will just give you puny bicycle. No, not a bicycle. It won't fit in there. A puny box with packing peanuts. That's why you should never do gambling, guys. If you do, I will be mad. And if you do, I'll be sad too. So don't gamble. Small sums of money. He'd meet up with friends at the local tavern to hear the latest gossip and jokes. But running a large farm was a serious business. It took up almost all his time. Washington rose early and had tea and pancakes with honey for breakfast. The pancakes were cut into small slices, which made it easier for him to eat. Then he would get on his horse and cover all 4 corners of his farm land. He helped drive the cattle and mend fences. At first, the farm raised and sold tobacco. Tobacco was difficult to grow, even though George Washington experimented with ways to improve his crops. Later on, he switched to growing wheat and built a mill to turn the wheat into flour. Wheat was much easier to grow, and he could sell it locally, whereas most of the tobacco was shipped to England. George Washington's 16-side barn cross section, the horses tread on the wheat. On the second floor, wheat grains fall through. Crackle. Yeah, I can't read that. It's in a different writing, so I can't read that word. CRAC something TS. In the floor. Workers? Question mark? Workers, I think? Yeah, cracks. Oh, it's fall through cracks in the floor. Workers below shoveled the grain into bags to be taken to the mill. Oh. There were no grocery stores or clothing stores in Virginia countryside. Expensive things like carriages and fancy clothes were shipped over from England. Almost everything else was grown on, made, or on the farm. Linen for clothes was spun and woven there. Wool came from Mount Vernon. Sheep at Mount Vernon. There were many people to feed and clothe. Between them, George and Martha owned as many as 300 slaves and had slaves grow in his crops and work his fields. Later in life, he began to see slavery for what it was: evil, cruel, and unjust. But for a long time, he accepted slavery as just the way things were. He was neither a very harsh nor kind master. During the 15 years as a farmer, George Washington had also an elected member of Virginia's House of Burgesses. The Burgesses were men who went in Williamsburg. It was the capital of the colony then. They voted on local issues. When even through 13 colonies belonged to England, they each had some of form even though the 13 colonies began to England, they each had some form of the self-government. As long as the king in Parliament, the government of England acted to the colonists. The slavery passage was so long, which I'm going to read anyway. Slavery. Slavery in America began in the early 1600s. In the 1750s, slavery was still legal. How? These days, guys, slavery is still going. I'm not telling you a joke. Slavery is still going, which is so brutal. I think it's still going, or they banned it. I hope they banned it. Slavery in America began in the early 1600s. In the 1750s, slavery was still legal in all 13 colonies. However, there were very few slaves in the North. The vast majority of slaves belonged to landowners. In Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia, yay! Georgia, why? In the North, there wasn't that much fertile soil. No cash crops to sell, such as tobacco or rice or cotton were grown in the South. Farmers mostly owned small plots of land. One family could manage all the work without extra hands. In the South, through some farms or plantations stretched for thousands of acres. They grew crops for profit. Many people were needed to work the fields and get the crops to market. Slaves were the cheapest source of labor. They received no pay, kidnapped from Africa, and sold at auction. Slaves had no rights. They were the property of their master, just like a plow or a horse. Besides George Washington, Thomas Jefferson was also a slave owner. In his will, George Washington stated that all his slaves were to be freed after Martha's death. However, he never freed any of them. While he was still alive, many northern colonies outlawed slavery by the late 1700s. but it took the Civil War 1865 to end slavery in the South for good. Yay. Interest. It was a pretty good arrangement. Most colonists were proud to be British subjects. Then in 1760s, the situation changed. This flag symbol, don't tread on me. This flag symbolized colonial defiance. Chapter 5. Let's see if this chapter is short, then I'll read it. If it's not, I'm not. Because I'm tired. And 56 and 43. I'm tired. So guys, that is going to be this end of the video. We read to chapter 5, which means I read 4 chapters. Woo! Because they haven't read chapter 5 yet, so that means I haven't read 5 chapters yet, which is weird. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm stretching right now. I've been sitting for so long. Okay, guys, I hope you enjoyed this 4 chapters of Who Was George Washington by Roberta Edwards, illustrated by True Kelly. A 5th grade book, and I hope you enjoyed. Bye! See you next time. If you want to. Bye! See you next time for